The most recent editorial published by the New York Post has sparked another surge of debate surrounding the Whittaker family. Instead of repeating claims, official updates, accusations, and content creator rivalry, this new write-up shifts its tone. It doesn't present itself as a breaking story, and it doesn't add new evidence. Instead, it frames a strong opinion about what the media, YouTube creators, and state agencies have done to this family. The Post claims that the Whittaker controversy has turned into a cultural spectacle, fueled by online fascination, reactive influencers, and inconsistent actions by those responsible for protecting vulnerable adults. Their take is simple but bold. An overlooked West Virginia family has become a national headline because the exploitation is profitable, both digitally and politically. According to the Post, the core issue is no longer about where the Whittakers live, whether their home is deteriorating, or even whether they receive donations meant for them. The editorial points towards something deeper. The American public is being encouraged to feel outrage without receiving clear facts, and the institutions involved are choosing silence while the public fights among themselves. The article suggests that the Whittakers have unintentionally become symbols, not symbols of poverty or disability alone, but symbols of how easily people without representation can be consumed, debated, exposed, and then abandoned by people who want to use their story. The Post goes on to describe this case as an example of empathy turned into entertainment, where even acts of kindness are repackaged as content pieces. When the editorial refers to content creators, it doesn't name them directly in the same accusatory way the investigative article did previously. Instead, it takes a step back. It criticizes the theater of YouTube humanitarianism, saying that a culture of live-stream justice can create more drama than solutions. It does not take sides with specific creators, but it does imply that many of them contribute to the noise rather than clarity. In that same breath, the Post addresses the state's role or lack of transparency. The opinion piece highlights how public confusion grows louder because government agencies offer little explanation, even when families are separated. For example, the editorial notes that the public still does not know the official legal reason for the removal of Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray. This leads to rumors, emotional arguments, and a fight for who's right, even though most outsiders do not have access to case details. The Post's editorial suggests that the state may be intentionally silent due to ongoing investigations involving donations, fundraising, decision-making, or third-party involvement. But it also criticizes how this silence harms Betty and the rest of the family, who now sit at the center of national attention with very few defenses. A family without legal representation is a family without a voice, the editorial writes, emphasizing that the Whittakers are being discussed by everyone except the people whose actions affect them directly. They also address something that most viewers don't think about: how legal battles can quickly ruin benefits. According to the piece, even if someone in the family chose to pursue legal action against creators accused of withholding funds, the outcome could jeopardize state benefits that the family relies on for medical, living, and disability support. In other words, suing might cost them more than not suing. This, to the Post, demonstrates how powerless they are in a system based on complicated policies they cannot afford to navigate. The article also questions why the state hasn't provided supervised visits, even when no accusations of physical abuse were publicly mentioned. It isn't accusing APS of wrongdoing, but it suggests that a lack of communication creates mistrust. With no statements from welfare agencies, people fill in the blanks with assumptions, anger, accusations, or conspiracy. The editorial links this gap to a cycle of public reaction and misinformation that benefits content creators more than the family at the center. One specific line in the editorial stands out. It reads, American compassion is easily distracted, but internet outrage is committed for life. It implies that the public isn't actually invested in the family's long-term well-being. People might watch videos, argue online, and demand justice, but few of those conversations lead to tangible solutions. Instead, viewers often reward sensational perspectives and ignore balanced, legal updates. The post states that this is why controversies like this boost engagement more than stories about resolution or support. The opinion piece also addresses how the Whittaker family's image has become commercialized. It argues that showing them eating, sitting in their living room, walking around their town, or interacting awkwardly on camera might generate empathy, but it also becomes a consumable product. Viewers build emotional connections to strangers they don't understand. In doing so, they sometimes forget the family's real needs: housing, medical care, supervised counseling, hygiene support, or basic legal advocacy. The Post claims that America is quick to feel sadness, but rarely willing to support systemic solutions. It wants a happy ending without doing the work of understanding social services, guardianship laws, or regional poverty challenges. The editorial hints that West Virginia's infrastructure is part of the issue. Many remote communities lack the mental health programs, disability services, or rural welfare resources seen elsewhere. The Whittakers are not just an individual family case. They are an example of how poverty intersects with government limitations. The article concludes with a strong critique of public reaction. It suggests that people want accountability, but not if accountability requires time, money, or complicated humanitarian work. The editorial claims that viewers want someone to blame because blame is easier than responsibility. Instead of asking how to help families like the Whittakers sustainably, the internet asks which creator is a villain, which agency is corrupt, or which article is lying. To the Post, the biggest issue now is not who kept the donations, who exposed the family, or who failed to build a new home. The biggest issue is how thousands of people became emotionally invested in a story they can't change, while the people inside the story still have no representation. The editorial suggests focusing less on accusations and more on how to provide long-term safeguards for vulnerable adults. It ends with this sentiment: the Whittakers did not ask for fame. Fame arrived at their door, filmed their living room, and then left them with problems they cannot solve. The newest Post editorial doesn't attempt to reveal new crime details, uncover secret locations, or expose content creators by name. Instead, it shifts the question: how did the Whittakers become a national debate without any clear accountability? The editorial makes one thing very clear: this isn't a mystery about who filmed them, who posted videos, or who donated. It's a story about how the American media system benefits from confusion. The Post argues that the Whittaker story only became breaking news because confusion creates stronger headlines than resolution. When law enforcement says very little, when adult protective services remain silent, and when content creators claim conflicting behind-the-scenes knowledge, the public becomes emotionally invested. This investment is fed by unanswered questions, which continue to generate views, arguments, and revenue. The editorial outlines a harsh truth: the story is financially valuable only as long as it remains messy. The piece criticizes mainstream journalism just as firmly as it critiques social media channels. It states that even major outlets can be selective in what they write. Most articles frame the Whittakers as unfortunate, mysterious, or suddenly torn apart. Few dive deep into West Virginia's historical economic struggles, the lack of rural disability support, or how guardianship systems actually function. Those issues require time, research, and nuance, none of which produce catchy, clickable titles. Instead, the Post writes that modern journalism borrows from YouTube's playbook, meaning it sells narratives instead of clarity. It also points out that YouTube creators, while less regulated, often mimic the same method: emotional storytelling, dramatic claims, and promises of justice. Whether intentionally or not, both media and influencer worlds end up monetizing suffering without fully addressing it. The post doesn't accuse everyone involved of malicious exploitation, but it suggests that most of them are motivated by reward systems that don't encourage long-term solutions. One striking argument made in the editorial is that state agencies benefit from letting silence do the work. When the government doesn't clarify why specific adults were placed under guardianship, speculation takes over. Some people assume abuse. Others assume financial fraud. Others believe it has to do with unsafe living conditions. The Post editorial notes that government agencies can avoid public backlash by simply letting the public argue itself into exhaustion. The controversy becomes a shield. When citizens are too busy arguing online, they rarely demand legal accountability from institutions. The editorial does not claim that West Virginia's APS acted incorrectly or with bad intentions. Instead, it highlights a structural issue in American Protective Services transparency. Agencies can legally protect information to honor privacy laws involving disabled adults. However, these laws can unintentionally prevent families and the public from knowing whether protective measures were justified. The Post argues that when privacy laws are applied without any form of communication, they create mistrust that harms families who already struggle with isolation and inequality. The Post mentions that this lack of clarity does not simply impact the public. It also directly affects the remaining family members, specifically Betty and Larry. The editorial emphasizes how painful it must be to lose siblings and a nephew without being given explanations, visits, or updates. The editorial explains that even if APS acted fairly, withholding reassurance or simple notification can cause emotional damage. Families deserve empathy, especially those already living in vulnerable circumstances. The Post suggests that protecting dignity should involve providing information, not stripping families of connection without warning. The editorial then turns its focus toward the public itself. The article critiques how audience reactions often transform into self-righteous outrage instead of tangible help. Emotional investment on social media creates tribes. Those who defend content creators, those who condemn them, those who blindly trust government agencies, and those who distrust any institution. Each group believes they are fighting for truth, but according to the Post, they are actually fighting to validate their emotional reaction, not to protect the Whittakers. This part of the editorial explains that American social media activism has a pattern: drama-driven empathy. People feel compelled to pick a side because they believe neutrality means ignorance. Yet, the editorial challenges readers to consider whether choosing a side benefits the family at all. It asks, does winning an argument online improve their housing, their care, their access to supervised visits? The question is rhetorical. The Post believes the answer is no. The editorial also touches on economic motives. It suggests a hard truth: outrage is profitable. Videos, blog posts, Facebook discussions, and even rebuttal live streams draw attention. Views and clicks translate into revenue. The Whitakers, meanwhile, do not receive payment every time their names are mentioned. The editorial points out that even media criticism becomes part of the monetization cycle. People are paid to comment on who is paid to comment about a family who never asked to be seen. At one point, the Post compares the Whittaker story to past social cases where families became public figures without permission. It references previous situations in which children with disabilities, people with rare medical conditions, and individuals from remote communities became subjects of documentaries. It argues that history repeats itself when vulnerable individuals become accidental celebrities, gaining attention but not support. Society exposes them for the emotional impact, but fails to build infrastructures that protect them once the cameras leave. The next part of the editorial centers on trust, specifically how trust collapses when too many stakeholders claim to protect the same vulnerable group. The government says it is protecting them. Content creators say they are protecting them. Journalists claim they are exposing exploitation to protect them. Online advocates say they are fighting for justice. But in this competition, the Whittakers themselves are not the ones making choices. The Post labels it protective rivalry. It argues that any system in which protection becomes argumentative cannot truly provide safety. The editorial describes the Whittakers as passengers in a story driven by others. They appear in headlines, videos, debates, and fundraising plans, yet they are rarely consulted, not because they cannot speak, but because decisions are made in rooms they are never invited into. The Post highlights a moral issue, a system where control is taken without consent. The public sees a family of adults living in poverty and assumes they must be managed by someone else. This belief fuels institutional control, content creator intervention, and external decision-making that leaves them voiceless. Another key argument from the editorial is about representation. The Whittakers have no legal representation speaking for them publicly. The editorial suggests that if the family had a designated lawyer or spokesperson, much of what is happening, confusion, speculation, blame, would look very different. Without representation, others speak for them, whether sincerely or for personal gain. The editorial calls this problem the cost of poverty. When people cannot afford lawyers, accountants, or medical advocates, they become dependent on systems they cannot question. They become dependent on content creators who offer benefits with strings attached. They become dependent on government agencies that cannot publicly explain their decisions. According to the Post, poverty doesn't just limit opportunities, it limits transparency. Toward the end of the piece, the Post writes that the controversy reflects a failure in American culture. Instead of supporting vulnerable families through structured care, long-term planning, disability services, and housing programs, we outsource their well-being to charitable strangers. Some of those strangers may mean well, others may not. But the system itself is the problem. The editorial implies that long-term care should not depend on internet popularity, fundraising disputes, or investigative reporting. The editorial closes with a subtle but strong message. It urges readers to question the systems, not the symptoms. It argues that families like the Whittakers need advocacy, not audiences. They need representation, not coverage. They need sustainable solutions, not viral attention. And ultimately, the Post suggests that if society were truly committed to their protection, there would be less noise and more action. The Post editorial shifts its direction in the second half, focusing not on blame, but on responsibility. It identifies a pattern that has formed around the Whittaker family: public fascination followed by abandonment. The article argues that the current chaos was inevitable once the family moved from private anonymity to viral exposure. The question is no longer who is guilty, but who is willing to take responsibility for restoring dignity. The editorial outlines 3 primary institutions involved in the story: government agencies, media outlets, and independent content creators. According to the article, none of these institutions are fully prepared to handle long-term outcomes. Government agencies are built for crisis intervention, not lifelong care plans. Media outlets are built for information distribution, not individualized support. Content creators are built for storytelling, not legal responsibility. Each institution steps in, but none remain long enough to shape solutions. They serve as temporary guardians of a narrative that outlives their involvement. The Post explains that modern society is structured around public response cycles. Something happens, it trends, and then the public moves on. The Whittakers became a spotlight topic because they did not fit the expected narrative. They are a rural Appalachian family with extreme genetic disabilities, living in poverty without access to basic services, yet surrounded by online attention and millions of dollars in donation disputes. Their circumstances defy simple explanation, and therefore, people stay invested. The editorial argues that as long as confusion exists, their story will not fade. What concerns the editorial board most is not the exploitation of attention, but the absence of sustainable structure. The article states that the Whittakers needed a lawyer, financial planner, and social worker before they needed cameras. Their home required inspection before it required interviews. They needed modified housing and personalized care plans before they needed merchandise or subscriptions. The Post suggests that America has become comfortable with documenting suffering rather than preventing it. The editorial calls this phenomenon performative empathy. People watch, react, and sometimes donate, but the donation becomes an emotional release, not a solution. Even if money is sent, it does not guarantee it will be managed, protected, or used constructively. As the Post editorial puts it, donations are not strategies. A strategy requires financial trusteeship, medical planning, legal protections, and ongoing supervision. Donations alone are temporary, vulnerable to mismanagement, manipulation, or simple misunderstanding. The Post acknowledges that content creators might not have had malicious intent. Some may have genuinely tried to help. But intent is not enough. If someone publicizes a disabled family and becomes involved in donation handling, the burden shifts from storyteller to caretaker. When that shift happens, oversight is required. Documentation, receipts, legal contracts, tax management, and proof of allocation become non-negotiable. The editorial criticizes creators who mixed family interaction with personal financial control, regardless of whether they meant to exploit. The moment money entered the equation, personal generosity became public accountability. The editorial also explores the controversial removal of Ray, Timmy, and Lorraine. The Post does not defend the government outright, but it argues that disability guardianship cases rarely happen without multiple assessments. It suggests that their removal likely involved more than just viral attention or misplaced donations. It implies there were likely concerns about safety, medical neglect, or intellectual vulnerability, combined with environmental instability. However, the Post acknowledges that none of these possibilities justify complete secrecy regarding their well-being once removed. The Post highlights a recurring American problem. The systems designed to protect disabled adults often disconnect them from family and community without providing emotional continuity. Families are expected to trust agencies blindly. Disabled individuals are expected to adapt to strange environments without explanation. Communities are expected to accept silence instead of transparency. The editorial argues that protective systems focus heavily on legal liability, but rarely on emotional responsibility. The article makes a bold suggestion. If agencies can remove vulnerable individuals, they should also be required to provide supervised reunification opportunities. Emotional connection should be part of disability care. The editorial implies that if Ray, Timmy, and Lorraine are physically healthy, safe, and properly housed, there should be a framework for visitation, not isolation. The Post criticizes the idea that protection requires separation, calling it a misguided interpretation of safety. The editorial also reflects on the idea that the public has unknowingly become part of the controversy. Viewers are not passive. They influence outcomes. Their outrage pressures agencies, encourages investigations, and influences the careers of content creators. Their comments and viral theories push the story forward. The post does not condemn viewers for caring, but it suggests that emotional advocacy without strategy becomes volatility. It destabilizes instead of supports. The post then asks a pivotal question. If everyone claims to want justice for the Whittakers, why isn't anyone fighting for a formal legal advocate on their behalf? The editorial notes that a court-appointed guardian ad litem, a disability rights lawyer, or even a publicly verified nonprofit could provide structure. These resources would not only manage funds, but also protect visitation rights, ensure ethical treatment, and remove financial control from influencers or loosely supervised fundraisers. According to the editorial, the only real solution is legal representation, not digital debate. The article also contemplates the future. It asks whether the Whittakers' story will become a blueprint for how society treats families like them. Will rural, disabled communities become viral entertainment? Will donations continue to flow into private pockets? Will protective agencies remove individuals without providing emotional support? Or will a standard be set that ensures representation, transparency, and accountability? The post issues a challenge to policymakers, disability advocates, and media leaders. If the goal is protection, there must be infrastructure. If the goal is dignity, there must be communication. If the goal is financial fairness, there must be documentation. The post does not take sides, but clearly sides with structure. The editorial advocates for oversight, transparency, and long-term planning, not viral content, emotional arguments, or investigative speculation. The article concludes with an observation. In America, justice is not determined by who tells the story loudest, but by who has the authority to act. The post suggests that until someone with legal responsibility steps in on behalf of the Whittakers, the arguments will continue, the speculation will grow, and the family will remain caught in limbo. They are not protected by outrage. They're trapped by it. In closing, the post writes that the Whittaker story is not about guilt, exposure, or entertainment. It is about accountability. And accountability requires systems, not sentiment. Comment below. What do you think the Whittaker family needs most right now? Legal representation, supervised family visits, or financial transparency? The last section of the post's editorial takes on a firm but direct tone. It does not seek to stir outrage, nor does it attempt to defend any individual party. Instead, it frames the situation as a mirror to America's current relationship with poverty, disability, and publicity. The Post argues that the Whittaker controversy reveals a society that reacts to crisis emotionally, distributes blame irrationally, and then fails to implement sustainable solutions. The article begins by challenging the narrative that poverty is solely a private struggle. According to the Post, extreme poverty in a hyper-connected world becomes public property. The moment the Whittakers appeared on camera, the world took ownership not just of their image, but of their fate. Their story entered the realm of public morality, and with that shift came both responsibility and exploitation. The editorial states that the Whittakers were not simply filmed. They were absorbed into a collective conscience that neither understands nor knows how to protect them. The Post contends that the concept of ownership is the root of today's debate. Content creators believe they own the right to share the story. Donors believe they own the right to decide how their contributions should be spent. Government agencies believe they own the right to determine care without consultation. None of these groups truly owned anything, yet each acted as though they held unquestionable authority. The editorial points out that ownership without accountability leads to chaos, and chaos is exactly what has unfolded. It also questions the moral motivations behind exposure. Was the initial documentary meant as advocacy, exploration, entertainment? The Post argues that even if the intentions were pure, the aftermath proves that intentions are irrelevant once a vulnerable population enters the marketplace of public attention. Once monetization begins, morality becomes measurable. Metrics replace empathy. Views replace community. Profits replace protection. And the line between exploitation and storytelling blurs beyond recognition. Central to the Post's argument is the idea that Americans have grown accustomed to short-term empathy. The nation reacts passionately in the moment, but fails to sustain that passion in policy or structure. Social causes rise quickly and fall faster. The Whittakers, the editorial says, became a temporary symbol of rural neglect, then a source of controversy, and now a case study in legal ambiguity. The real work, improving their quality of life, remains unfulfilled. The country became emotional, then distracted, then confused. The Post insists that what the Whittakers need is not sympathy, nor outrage, nor online activism. They need consistency, sustainable care, trusted legal oversight, medically tailored support, housing stability, real planning. These are not the responsibilities of content creators or commenters. They require institutional resources and professional expertise. And yet, ironically, none of those solutions are being publicly discussed with the same intensity as accusations about missing money. The final argument of the editorial focuses on the concept of dignity. The Post notes that dignity is the element missing from nearly every stage of the Whittaker story. Their image was consumed without consent. Their struggles were laid bare without filters. Donations were handled without verification. Family members were removed without explanation. Their name became a headline, a hashtag, and a cautionary tale, but not a protected identity. Poverty stripped them of choice. Fame stripped them of privacy. The Post states that the Whittakers deserve what every American deserves: the right to exist without being used, the right to receive help without paying for it emotionally, the right to family connection without secrecy, the right to legal clarity without digital interference, the right to financial protection without being commodified. The editorial argues that disability should not be entertainment, poverty should not be spectacle, and rural isolation should not be capitalized by those who visit only long enough to benefit. Toward the conclusion, the editorial offers a list of systemic recommendations. It proposes that when content creators expose vulnerable communities, they should be required to follow guidelines similar to those used in journalism: documentation, consent standards, receipt transparency, and mandatory third-party trustees for donations exceeding a certain amount. It suggests that states create specialized social work units for viral cases, ensuring that sudden public exposure does not result in destabilization or exploitation. The Post recommends that disability guardianship laws include visitation guarantees, unless there is proven danger, and that family members must be informed at minimum about the living conditions of their loved ones. In what may be its most pointed statement, the editorial writes, "People cannot be protected in silence." It condemns the secrecy surrounding the current location of Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy, describing it as a violation of their emotional dignity. The article emphasizes that protection should not feel like disappearance. Guardianship should not resemble custody. Vulnerability should not invite erasure. The Post challenges West Virginia officials to issue public policy statements clarifying how they intend to balance privacy law with humane communication. The editorial ends by reframing the entire debate. It states that the Whittaker controversy is not ultimately about fraud, content creators, viral videos, or poverty tourism. It is about America's failure to address disability and rural poverty with infrastructure instead of spectacle. The editorial asserts that until the nation invests in systems rather than emotional reactions, more families like the Whittakers will fall into similar chaos. Not because people don't care, but because care alone is not enough. The final paragraph reads like a directive. It says that the Whittaker family should not be remembered as a viral anomaly nor pitted as helpless victims. They should be recognized as a symbol of what happens when vulnerable communities are given visibility without protection, generosity without structure, and sympathy without accountability. The post concludes that the Whittakers deserve more than attention. They deserve justice, the kind only systems, not stories, can provide. Comment below. Should media outlets and content creators be legally obligated to follow specific guidelines when documenting vulnerable communities? Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.